Okay, so continuing on from the first part, um, so I talked about how we have representations in networks and we have representation in models and we could compare them. But in some applications, you may want to predict brain activity from the networks, right? So this application is, for example, if I had a system where let's say somebody is suffering from blindness, they have some, there's some things that their eye cannot record the signals and then send it to the rest of the brain. And you're like, what if I want to actually inject activation based on some camera inputs, right? And again, this is far from reality, but let's say in a future where I want to know that the activity of this brain area would be this and respond to this specific visual image. So that you could directly stimulate, um, that activity in the brain. Um, there are other applications, and I'm going to talk about a little bit of them, but the idea is that, well, the brain is looking at this image. Can you use the representation inside the models in order to predict the recorded activity? So if I go back to this figure, I said, well, we could find correspondence using those sorts of representational similarity analysis. We could find correspondence between the layers. What if we took this representation, use another network, and then predict neural activity with it? That's what we call encoding. Decoding is the opposite direction. What if a person was looking at this image and they had some neural activity, and that neural activity, can you actually use that neural activity and decode the image that people were looking at? So that's the decoding task. You're decoding the activity into something that they were looking at. Now, imagine later on it will be applied to imagination. When we have really good models, maybe when you're imagining something, when you have some inner thoughts, can we decode that to actual written words or to images? And these are extremely useful applications. For example, with encoding, I was talking to a group where they're doing using these encoding models that can tell you what the neural activity would be, to help patients by generating images that would maximally activate certain brain areas. So maybe and that could help rehabilitate some brain anomalies or damages. So they're very useful applications. Our decoding is an example here. I'm gonna get to it. I'll talk about it more, where you're recording from the brain area and you're decoding maybe the person's intended speech, like what they were trying to say. But maybe they cannot articulate it because they have some, muscle, they've lost muscle mass or they have lost connections to those muscles in order to control them. So if you want to build an encoding model, if you want to build a model that could predict neural activity, you first have to record neural activity, right? You have to say, let's say this person is sitting in the scanner, like an fMRI scanner, they're looking at these images. And when they look at these images, their brain activity is recorded. There are many different ways to record brain activity. You could do them using fMRI, you could use EEG, you could use single cells, you could use arrays of cells, you could use so many different things. But in this case, they're using functional magnetic resonance imaging, where they record from the brain and then they have the activity. There's a network, like a artificial neural network, where it also gets the same image and it tries to classify it as, oh, it's a cow, it's this, it's that. And then you take these representations from the network and then you linearly map them to activity in the brain. Right? Does that make sense? So this is basically you're trying to say, can I know what the area inferior temporal of the person was responding based on the fact that what the representation of the network was. And a lot of times we could do this pretty well because, again, there's similarity between the representation of the network and the representation in the brain. And I'm going to use the word representation hoping that you have an idea of what I'm referring to. So if you do that, this is something from our own work, recent work under review, where now, as I said, you could take the cortex. This is the brain, left hemisphere, right hemisphere. So let's say this is my brain, and I'm taking it and opening it up. So you see the two hemispheres. Not only that, I could cut the behind of it and just open it up like a piece of paper. So this is what it will look like at the end. This is one the right hemisphere cortex and left hemisphere cortex. I'm opening it up and I'm just opening it up like a book. So this brain, the cut is on this side. So imagine I cut it. So when the two, so this is what it would look like. This is right hemisphere, left hemisphere. Let's open him up and then open him. And that's what it will look like. And I'm showing that we're able to predict the activity of different areas of this pretty well. This is the encoding accuracy, meaning that how well we could say what the brain would respond to this image. And we were able to do that pretty well. We suggested some new methods of doing it that was better than other methods.
When you mean well, does it mean that it flashes up all the time? That is exactly where it is. It doesn't change.
Flashes out, say that again.
Well, because you're saying that you can encode it pretty well. When you say pretty well, does that mean that like if you show this image to 600 participants, the same area shows up every time?
So brains are different from one another. So the response, if you look at one image and I'm looking at a specific, very fine-grained area in the brain, and I'm looking at the same image, would not be the same response.
It won't be the same.
But it's the same like general area.
Yes.
Just like a different shape.
Yeah, so it's the same general area. So we train these networks, the encoding networks that I'm showing here, we train them for individuals.
So one person.
Let's say one person. There are cases where you could train them on multiple individuals and then so-called fine-tune them on an individual. But let's say we're training for one individual. For one individual, if I put them in the scanner, their visual cortex has 20,000, in fMRI lingo, we call them voxels. So 20,000 millimeter cubes that is on the surface of their cortex. And I have 20,000 in each hemisphere, let's say. It means that for this person, when I show them an image, I can report 40,000 numbers that says this is the activity of the brain of this person in response to this image. I show them another image, I get a very different pattern of activation. I show another image, I get a very different pattern of activation. And those activations are the representation, a brain representing those images. And I want to predict those for individual images. So I feed the same images to the network, and I get the representation of the network for each image, and then I learn a mapping from that to the representation.
So how much has this improved? I mean, I saw those studies from like Jack Allen in 2011.
Yeah.
Was that kind of like the pioneering research, or was there even things happening before that? And like how much better is it?
I think a lot of the good encoding stuff came from that lab in the late, maybe 2008, 9, and then 11. Actually they developed this way of visualizing the cortex.
That was their original idea.
Yeah, that's their Galant's lab, where they figured out a way to map, because you could use this for all different subjects. So you can actually project different subjects' brain into the same space, we call it Epis average. And that's what they worked a lot. The tool that I use is from that lab. No, we've improved them a lot since then, because then the data scale was small. Like we didn't have that many image fMRI pairs. And also the models weren't that good. They weren't these deep learning models. Now we have deep learning models, we have transformer, if you know what that is, transformer-based models, and we have a lot more images. Like for example, this data set, they showed one individual like 10,000 images, and they recorded their brain activity. So that scale wasn't there until like 2-3 years ago, where one person, that means that this data collection took probably a year, for this person to come back maybe 40 different sessions. Like once a week, they have to come back, they see a bunch of images, they come back the next week. So it takes like a whole year to collect that much data.
Do they see the same images again, or they see all different images?
So in this experiment, they saw one image 3 different times, but they also saw 10,000 different images.
Right.
The reason you do that, you want to find out what's the reliability, because brain doesn't respond the same way every single time. So what you predict is the average across those 3 repetitions. You're saying that you saw this image 3 times, what was your brain activity? And in this case, again, brain activity means how active different areas are. If you're recording from single cells, you're saying those how active how active these single cells are. That's Solar. I think he's kind of lost in this moment.
Yeah.
So if it's a single cell, you're trying to figure out how active the single cells are. But if it's a voxel, the voxel is a collection of thousands of cells.
Yeah.
So you're looking at that average activity of 1,000 cells.
Yeah.
Um,
And that could change even if it's the same image.
of course, right? It depends on the state of the person, if it's in the morning or the afternoon, if they ate food. Yeah, like those things change your overall look. Over there. So things change. There are so many things we cannot control as experimenters. What you can do is that you could show people multiple instances of the same image and then average that out and be like, this is the signal. This is not, I'm getting rid of some of the noise. fMRI is tricky because there are so many sources of noise. If they move in this scanner, if they do, a lot of things can change the quality of neural data. In this study, as I said, they had 8 subjects. Now I have it down here. And each of them saw around up to 10,000 images. One image repeated multiple times, and then they record the fMRI activity from the whole brain. And then I'm showing just back of the brain here. And then, yeah, they use the network, and then you could just map it from what. So, as I said, we did some of these experiments, and then we achieved the state of the art as so-called in this domain of trying to predict neural activity. So in a way, we have a network that we're not necessarily claiming that does everything like the brain. And this is an important distinction, right? If I have a system that could predict the behavior of another system, it doesn't mean that it's copying all those mechanisms, right? You could have a system that could predict another system's behavior without necessarily doing everything the same way. There's degeneracy in the brain, there's degeneracy in complex systems. You could arrive at similar solutions from very different routes. But what this gives us, and we extended this to the whole brain. Now, as I said in my description, if I have it like this, and I open it up, the visual cortex will be down here, right? This is where the visual cortex is. This is where the nerve endings from the eye end up. And for that reason, these areas are very selective to image features. And for that reason, we're able to predict them well with a network that is trained also for images. But also there are areas that are outside this region that are representing visual inputs, right? But you can imagine some areas are maybe language selective, others selective to other stuff. They're not necessarily predicted by how a model that is trained for visual. Diffusion models. What do we know about diffusion models? Where have you seen that?
Like stable diffusion, majority.
Yeah, so what do you use that for? You use it for generating images. How do they work? Do we know the mechanics of them?
Like certain images have, like if you're doing like a text image, like depending on the images that it has in its database, like there are certain text tags that it associates with them, and depending on your input, like if you want like a girl with the girl earring, type that in the style of like Banksy or something.
Yeah.
You type that in, and then it looks for all of it is with that tag and kind of builds like a general picture. The kind of like in between part is where it kind of breaks down.
So yeah, so think about, so there is no image out there, let's say, girl with the pair of earring with sunglasses, right? That image doesn't exist in the world, supposedly, right? So you're trying to create something that doesn't exist. So you cannot just go and look at a massive database of like 50 billion images and pull up that image. What they do is that they're interpolating between different images, right? They're interpolating between a lot of images with sunglasses, a lot of gold images, a lot of gold with pearl earrings. And interpolating all of that, you could create an image that has, you know, girl with pearl earrings with sunglasses, for example. But the way they do that is a denoising process. You start from noise, and then you denoise that process using information from that text prompt. And when you use Midjourney, that's how it works. It starts from noise, and then it slowly removes noise from the image, depending on the text input you gave it, to get there. Now, we could use these networks in NeuroAI research by attaching them to an encoder. If I have a model that could predict brain activity, instead of using text to guide the diffusion process, I could use brain activity from the encoder to do that. So instead of generating images for a girl with sunglasses, I could generate images that maximally activate the brain area. That's something that, for example, you could do in monkeys too. You know, you could continually, so there are experiments where, I don't have maybe the text here, but we'll here for that. So you could use a monkey in the loop, actually, monkey in the loop, where you change the image and then you're recording from another.
I've always been obsessed with this notion of the methodologies that we use to investigate what neurons meaning what kind of visual stimuli trigger.
So he's saying, what kind of visual input triggers a neuron, like makes it go crazy? Like I showed you, for example, in classical studies, they were playing with light. But if you go higher up, then it's not just light that activates a cell, it's more complex visual inputs. So you could use one of these diffusion models in the loop, and this is Carlos had mentioned, where you use, oh, it's not happy demo actually. Oh, so, that's not what it was. Okay, so they could record from the monkey and then have a generator change the image. Instead of an experimenter just changing the light direction and stuff like that, it could generate really complex images of faces, of other stuff, and then you could explore that space, and then suddenly you could arrive at a place where it's maximally activated, that cell. And you're saying, okay, this is what this cell is responding. We could use that using an encoder. Now, because we don't have a monkey in the loop, we could use our brain encoder, because brain encoder is supposed to be a term that people use, digital twin. Digital twin means that it behaves like you, but it's not you. How do we get that? Well, if I record from your brain activity and build a model that could act as if it's your brain, then it's a digital twin. And a lot of people would want to build their digital twins. Imagine a tech bro would want to do that, right? They would want to create these constructs that behaves like them or have neural activity like them. So they're pouring a lot of money into this. For example, Tether, which is like a cryptocurrency, has invested a lot of money in BlackRock Neurotechnologies, which is just a company that creates these Utah arrays that we use for recording. The reason being they really want to get into that business of BCI and predicting brain activity and those sorts of things.
BCI.
Brain computer interfaces. So we could take a brain area and generate images, or as you said, go find images that maximally activated based on our encoder. The encoder tells us, well, for this image, the neural activity should be this, for this image, the neural activity should be that. You could just find images that maximally activated. or you could go generate them. And you see, these are generated images, so they're not super clean, but what they do is that they pack a lot of faces in there because they know this area it tells you something about this area. It's very responsive to faces.
But wait, but isn't that just one person? Are you
Yeah.
basing this on one person? So, but you're saying everybody's brains are different. So you're just saying we can predict it from this one individual.
Yeah, so we're
Not
saying,
for everybody. Okay.
but we could also look at similarities across different subjects. For example, let's say this is a different area, and we looked at multiple subjects to generate images or find images that maximally activate this area. And you can see subject 1, 2, and these are the 4 subjects in that they study. What do you see here? Well, we see maybe tool use. You see what I mean? So you could find, if you look at images that you generated or retrieved from a large data set that maximally activate this parcel in the brain, and if it agrees across subject, you can see maybe this area does processing with tool use, something like that.
So that's when we get too close to universal design.
There you go. And so that's what we're going to do on the cultural probe, but less related to computation now. If you want to go there, it's okay, but someone wants to develop something like that, you know, or to train a network or something like that, you can try, you know, but also you can do the low tech way, but the subject is the same.
So many
Yeah.
versions
So-
for.
This idea of, and you could give it to Chat GPT or GPT-4 and be like, what is similar among these? And
Yeah.
it's like, so a trend that you'll see is that some people choose to not use subjects anymore and just use an LLM role playing as a subject. They're saying, imagine you're a subject in an experiment. How would you respond to this? That sort of thing. It's cheaper, I guess.
Is it kosher though?
Is it kosher?
Right, like,
Is-
I mean, like,
is Chat-
I mean, like, for somebody else programmed Chat GPT, right? So, you know, Chat GPT will predict in certain ways for certain prompts, and so are you, it's a little,
Yeah,
from
it's like,
create-
this
somebody
is
might
not
create
for,
a
yeah,
prompt.
this is just,
Yeah.
if I have these images from different subjects and I want to be like, I don't want to bias, I don't want to bring my own bias into telling you what's common among them.
Yeah,
I could ask ChatGPT to tell me what's common among them. And it's just a matter of saying, okay, it's not my bias, but ChatGPT saying, oh, all these images that maximally activate this area seem to be of hand using a unique or unconventional tool in a creative or practical task. So it kind of tells you something about it depends on how you use it.
yeah.
I think this is okay. As a subject in this experiment, just telling us, just saying, okay, I'm not biasing it. Yes, to me it appears that it's tool use, but let ChatGPT.
Another example is that when the early facial recognition, they did have biases, right, with like skin color, but it was kind of built into the system. Like the system's as good as how the data you trained it on, you
Yeah.
know, so while we don't quite understand the biases that you might have, but there are, like,
Yeah.
let's say there are biases.
That's fine. But yeah, in this case, I think it works fine. So with diffusion models, another thing you could do is decode. Now, if I want to decode, if I have a person in the scanner and I'm looking at their brain activity and I want to see what they're looking at that moment, right? I don't know what they're looking at, but I know what their brain activity is. And if I'm claiming that the brain is representing those visual input, then that information should exist for me to be able to decode it.
Yeah.
So what we do is that in this work, a lot of people done that, this is a recent work we've worked on, is that we're training the diffusion model, as I said, instead of being guided by a text, it's guided by neural activity. Use neural activity to tell us, to generate image that maps onto that activity. So for example, we could, for this subject, this is trained per subject again. These are the images they were looking at, for example, up top, and these are the images that we decoded from that neural activity. So when they were looking at this airplane and we were able to decode that, well, our generator, our diffusion model generates this image for that neural activity. Now this has to be trained. The model because we have 10,000 image fMRI pairs, we could actually train the model saying, with this, imagine how that Mid-Journey is trained. Mid-Journey is trained using internet data of image text pairs. They give it the text, they say, okay, this text has to lead to this image eventually. And they give like billions of pairs of images and text. It's a massive data set. We have a small data set, but they still managed to make it work, where you give it the fMRI activity and tell it this should be what you predict. This is a separate training and test set. And then in a test set, we give it just an fMRI activity and tell it, okay, now predict what the image must have been, and then it could do that. So these methods are getting really good. It's still, you don't get all the details, right? You get, there is a sporting event, baseball maybe, but you get that there is a plate, you don't get all the details, right?
Feels like with some of these, like, there's certain gravity of some features that, like, I don't know, like, how to phrase it. You know what I'm getting at, right?
There's a biases towards certain features.
Yeah.
So because you're trained it in a certain way, there are biases towards certain features. So hopefully this works. So as I said, the way a diffusion model works is through denoising. Now, because we're getting information from different parts of the brain, we could see in that denoising process which parts of the brain which information from which parts of the brain are used in different steps of denoising. So we're looking at here as this image of a giraffe. So this is how any diffusion model would work. It's a denoising process. You start from, as I said, you start from noise, and then you use the information from the prompt to denoise it. And here the prompts are different brain areas. So you see, a lot of it is on higher level visual areas, some lower level visual areas, if you remember how it works. This is an interesting way of looking at, for example, you could do this with language models, with diffusion models that are based on text. You give it, oh, I want an image of a giraffe in the beach. And if as it's generating the image of a giraffe on the beach, you can see, okay, in this step, as the giraffe is becoming more clear, it's attending to the word giraffe in the text prompt. You could show it that way. Yeah. So let's go on. All right. So maybe I'll talk more about decoding, since we are on the topic of decoding and not going to attention yet. I could come back to attention later. So you can imagine something that you really want to decode is intended action. What I just showed is decoding visual content from the brain. It could be from either imagery, like what you're imagining, what you're dreaming, or it could be from visual input. We're not yet there to decode mental imagery well, but that's an active area of research. I think it requires a lot more data, so that's the bottleneck. But what really seems to be working well these days is, and it's been an active research for a good 30, 40 years, is decoding intended action. What does that mean? It means that if I put electrodes in your dominant, and most of the time these are implanted in the hand area, the dominant hand area. So people have mapped out how a certain parts of the brain corresponds to different parts of the body. How do you map this out? Is this the right link? That's fine. You could do stimulation. You could actually stimulate parts of this band around here, so the band is right here in the two hemispheres. Now, you know that the right side of the brain controls the left part of the body, and vice versa, right? Everything gets flipped in the brain. And it all has to do with the fact that there are lenses in the eye, and when that's flipped, your entire world has to be flipped for it to be consistent. So if the band here, so up here controls my left side of my body, and you could see it because they're stimulating with something called TMS, transmagnetic stimulator.
And then stimulate. So the first thing, she's going to put the magnetic coil over top of the area of my motor cortex that's responsible for the muscles of my hand form. Once she's there, she's going to deliver a magnetic pulse. Oh, and we have this on an arm twitch there. And we can also see this response over here on the oscilloscope because we've measured it using the EMG electrodes over the muscles of my hand form. Now what we're going to do is move that magnetic coil over the span of my motor cortex from one side all the way over to the next. And what you'll see is muscles slowly recruited from my hand up to my elbow, shoulder, right leg. And after she switches hemispheres, we'll see some of the left leg come in and then down the muscles of my left arm. So here we go.
So the stimulation is on the left hemisphere. So it's going to be on the right side of the body.
So the elbow, from shoulder and leg. Feel right leg. Little response to my left leg there, we switch hemispheres. More leg on the left side.
So
Please take it.
you can imagine that with this method or other methods, you can map something like this, and that's how you get a map like this, where you're saying, oh, I went from the leg and then the shoulders and then the mouth is overrepresented, as you could imagine. But the hand is super overrepresented, and we have really dexterous hands, and that's part of our evolution. And you could really, it's a huge area. So if I want to get the best intended movement signal, a lot of time you choose to put it, for me, on the right dominant. So you would put this electrode array in the left hemisphere in the dominant hand, which would be the dominant hand area. And I showed you the device that I showed you is transcranial magnetic stimulation. It's actually FDA approved for depression, I think, where they try to stimulate non-invasively different parts of the brain. So if you have, as I said, people are researching it for different things. One of them is this, where they stimulate certain brain areas, saying, well, if this part is dopaminergic, or if a certain pathway have to be activated between one area and another area, they could use a device like this. But for experiment, you could see, well, what is the effect on different parts of the body? So using this method, you could actually do a lot of these mapping stuff. And the mapping, not surprisingly, matches across motor and somatosensory, meaning that if I stroke my arm, it's going to be an area similar to the areas where I'm making a movement, because a lot of these go together. So how would I build the brain-computer interface? So let's say this person is paraplegic, that they cannot move their body below their neck, and a tetraplegic. How would they control a robotic arm? Well, you say, what if I could record from their dominant hand area, and these are called Utah arrays. So instead of just recording one cell, you're recording 8 by 8, around 64 of them at the same time. And you could look at their activity. This is what's called a raster plot. Each of these lines is an action potential. Each row is a cell, for example, or different trials of the same cell, depending on how it's visualized. You could say, well, if I have all this neural activity, what if the person intends to move their hand forward? What if they intend to move their hand backward, to the right, to the left? And I look at the neural activity of that intention. And I record so many data points. I'm saying, let's do this 1,000,000 times. I put a cursor on the screen and I ask them to move it up, but I instruct them to move it up. I instruct it to move it down. I instruct it to move it right. I'm instructing them to, and I'm going to do it 1,000,000 times. And I have 1,000,000 data points that associate direction of movement with the neural activity. Now what I could do is that when I deploy this tool, I could say, okay, intend to move it however you want. And then I see how similar is that neural activity to the ones that I recorded before. and then I could decode their intention. Make sense? So this is the process of a brain-computer interface, where you're recording some signal. These signals, you have to process it, you have to denoise it, and then there's a control signal that is decoded from it. For example, in this case, playing Pong, and or controlling a robotic arm. And the person sees it, like you see that the Pong is not moving in the direction you want, so you try harder, and then you co-evolve with the system. You put people in a feedback loop, amazing thing happens, right? They just see, okay, if I do this, this happens. Okay, if I want to make it do that, I'll make that happen. But this requires a lot of data collection. I'll show you an example of a research in monkeys, because I think that's very relevant.
Is there a reason why they use macaque monkeys over other
For
ones?
for what?
Generally for like PCI.
Because it depends on the quality of the data, right? If I am able to implant electrodes, and these only with very small percentage of people could do that. It may become more when these systems get better and people choose to implant electrodes in their brain, but for now, it's people who are tetraplegic, for example, they cannot move anything. So where would you do that research? Well, you could do that research in monkeys. You could at least make your system, modify it, come up with a good learning algorithm and test it in monkeys.
They just decided to choose one species and run
Oh,
with it so that
well,
it's like
because it's
standardized.
closest to us.
Yeah,
So there are practical considerations. And there's also, you don't want to do this in a species that doesn't have a brain like us. So you want to go with a non-human primate.
Mhm.
But a lot of them are too big and some of them are too small. So macaque is just the right thing.
like I feel like a chimp is probably harder to control, even though it's much closer.
Even these macaques are not, we're being recorded. So so macaque seems to be a good model, and eventually it all depends on what NIH funds. And for what it's worth, the models that people study right now are macaques, are mice, and like C. elegans, these worms that you see, and the fruit flies. Right, these four have become the main models that NIH funds. So, and also there's a network effect, right? If other people are researching something, you end up, and they develop methods for that and protocols for that, you end up using. It's all, a lot of it is practicalities. So you could do this research.
He's a 9-year-old mechanic who had a neuron placed in each side of his brain.
Something that Neuralink did was they figured out to make a lot of these things wireless. So when you implant the electrodes, you could let the scalp heal underneath it. You don't have to keep the chamber open. And it's wirelessly communicating neural activity to a computer.
About 6 weeks ago. If you look carefully, you can see that the fur on his head hasn't quite fully grown back yet. He's learned to interact with the computer for a tasty banana smoothie delivered through a straw. We can interact with the neurons simply by pairing them to an iPhone, just as you might pair your phone to a Bluetooth speaker. The links record from more than 2,000 electrodes implanted in the regions of Page's motor cortex that coordinate hand and arm movements. Neurons in this region modulate their activity with intended hand movement.
So you see, they're by flashing different parts of the screen, the monkey knows that, okay, I'm supposed to control the cursor to get there, and then it gets a reward in a juice. That way you're collecting a lot of data. Why? Because right now the monkey is actually doing it with their hand. And if it's doing it with his hand, you get really clean motor area activity, and you get the actual movement as well. So you say, okay, I know this movement, I know what movement they're making, I know the neural activity, I could collect my data. After the data is collected, then you could unplug this thing, right? You could just.
It's unplugged. After only a few minutes of calibration, we can use the output from the decoder to move the cursor instead of the joystick.
So now what they're doing is that they just have neural data because the monkey intends to move in a certain direction. They don't need monkey's movement anymore. They could decode what the monkey is trying to do just from neural activity. Yeah.
That's cool.
Which is still moves the
They
joystick out of habit. But
And
actually,
they implanted this in a human, was it last year, who was a tetraplegic?
But
And he,
people like this.
yeah,
Like this, it's a Brazilian actually
Yeah.
from
nice,
the lab. So he's amazing.
yeah. And they collected some data, and the person was using it for a while. But the difficulty with these implants is that brains are alive and they move. Like every heartbeat, the brain just twitches a little bit. So things move around. So you have to continually recalibrate, but also it could become infected. It could become so a lot of problem with implants is that the physical substrate that you're implanting it in is just alive and it moves and the world changes and the person changes and the neural activity, right? So I mean, when you work with a complex system, again, I'm gonna go back to this idea of complexity, right? When you work with a complex system, if you grew up in Toronto and you always had an association, let's say, between the color of the leaves and like the season, and you move to Caribbean, would that association work? Does that make sense? So meaning that the reason I bring up the example is that the association between what the color of the leaves would be in a month of the year and that month is a very complex relationship. It's not like you have to, why would the color of leaf be green in this month has a lot to do with planetary movement and seasonal changes and all sorts of things, and photosynthesis and this and that and that. But you don't know all of that. But you could still form a relationship between two very complex things, two variables in a complex net system. Does that make sense? And it's reliable. If you live in Toronto and you come to New York, that it still works. You still could say, okay, because this tree, the leaves are this color, it must be, I don't know, October. And that association works. But then if you go out, the reason that association falls apart when you go outside of that environment is because you didn't really understand the relationship between them. You only formed an association, and that association only generalizes within a certain context. The relevance to this is that we're just taking neural activity and associating it with intended movement. It's ignoring the complexity of how that neural activity and intended movement are related to one another. It's just creating a map. And that mapping could fall apart in a few days. You have to recalibrate it because, well, the system is changing. You're moving from Toronto to Caribbean every 2 minutes in a way. That's the metaphor.
Is it closer to like what they say, it's more of a correlation than a causation?
Yeah, and it holds for a long time. It holds in certain situations, but as long as
There's
but
no reason or rhyme as why they connect.
yeah, if the system changes a little bit, then it doesn't work. If you move around, then it doesn't work anymore. So there is still very brittle.
Yeah, and just relating this to what we studied last week about affordances. So Gibson's theory of affordances and the constructed perception is really important because it's a theory of perception that changed everything because he says that we perceive the environments through affordances. So when a lion moves in an environment, he is perceiving through the lens of I need food right now. And this changes attentions, needs, and changes everything because when you change attention to what you pay attention to, it changes all the system. So that's the correlation between what Hussein is talking to philosophy and what we use in design. Gibson's theory is really, really important for architecture and design.
I think intended movement, as you said, has a lot to do with affordances and extending your body. So there's a much more complex relationship. But sometimes in life you say, okay, how can I push this as an engineering problem? How far can I push this by collecting a lot of data and associating neural activity with intended movement? Just learning this relationship between the signal and the control without worrying about all the complexities of the system. But that doesn't work, beyond some limited domain. So
Does it mean that if you have a lot more complexity of associations, does that mean more nodes get light up, or is it the depth of the nodes?
it depends. It could be a lot of different things. It's just that a lot of things in a system are emergent, and it's hard to describe everything beforehand. Like, and again, the reason we build models that have a lot of variables, like I was saying, weather prediction. The reason we build those models with a lot of things going into it is because the system is not reducible to simple relationships, right? And if it's not reducible to simple relationships, and biology is so wild in that sense that you can't just reduce it to simple stuff. You're saying the best I can do is to build a model that could predict the behavior rather than explain everything that happens.
Yeah, and when you add more and more variables, that's
Yeah.
usually the case, right?
That's,
Multivariate regression analysis.
that's really important when you construct your cultural probes. If you feel there are many variables, you need to cut down. So that's an interesting point there. You need to say, this works like that. No, too many variables. Let's reduce. That's an experiment. Well, so it's not the thing.
Right, so can you expand more nodes usage by having more and more variables, or is it? Like with the fall thing, like what if you learned that, there is now photosynthesis, how does that information add to your understanding of what's color changing and
Exactly, right? If you understand more of the underlying system, the hope is that you could build better decoding. We could form better, more generalizable associations.
it's got more data points or?
Because you understand more of the complexity of the system, so you could update it. So let's say you're saying, okay, can I update my model better in this new environment just because I have more, there are more things that I could play around with.
Would the pattern change if there was more variables we play around with?
Well, so it would make it, let's say your model of brain activity prediction or decoding also considers the time of the day. That's another variable, meaning that not only you're accused that you're taking the signal, you also take into account what time it is in the day when you have the control signal, when you are decoding the signal. Maybe that allows you to be better. Maybe because that variable was so important in changing the underlying representation that knowing what time of the day it is helps you decode better. But that's not necessarily guaranteed, and those things also change. That makes sense. Just having more variables is good as long as they don't add extra complexity to your mapping problem.
But you're already trying to process so many different variables when you get a subject into a group, right?
Yeah, well, in this
Already
case,
advanced.
so in the Neuralink example, they're recording from thousands of neurons,
Mm.
and they're mapping those to the intended movement. Other types of variables you could put in there, but they may not generalize well either, so you have to experiment with it. Okay, so it's 2:20, we're going on to
40, yeah.
2:40. So I have two sections that I could, one of them is about like expectation and how it feeds into classification and stuff like that. The other one is on attention and like modeling the attention. You pick which one.
I think the classification might be better for them. And then the attention one you have on your website as well. We can pass the class on attention.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So this is the example I was telling you earlier about how context so easily changes our perception, right? If you read this from left to right, it's A, B, C, and then when you come up down, it's like 12, 13, 14, right? It's so strongly, your perception of what's in the middle changes as just the way you're reading it. Just because the context changes, and a lot of the classification you were saying earlier depends on the context, right? How you classify things. So this this theory that I mentioned earlier that everything is just feed forward cannot really hold too well because this pattern in the middle, if it's going through a feed forward thing, why is in one condition it leads to a 13 and in one condition it leads to a V, right? So there must be some top-down effect that guides that feed forward process of information propagation. Another demo, if I ask you what this object is, what would you say?
Napkins.
Napkins could be a something, right? How about this object? A car, right? But in reality, these are the same set of pixels that are copied from one to the other, right? And you could see why this is important. Why is it called scene context? Is because in one of them, the rest of it looks like a building, and in here, it looks like a dinner table. And if you take those away, if you take the context away, then it's going to look like the same meaningless set of like pixels to you. But there's no, this does not look like a car, and this doesn't really look like a napkin in a sense. But the context impacts our perception of things. And the question becomes, what does it mean for that earlier when I said stuff could be just process feed forward? Alternatively, we could think that, well, as there is this ventral visual stream, this is the feed forward process that I mentioned earlier, going to so-called fusiform gyrus, which is down here. This is where a lot of the object selective patches in the brain, parcels in the brain are. You can imagine there is a slower process maybe where the top-down expectations play into this, where the context of what you're looking at plays into this. And this is more bottom up and top down, or feed forward and feedback. These are all very dubious terms. They don't, they're used a lot and they mean different things to different people. So they're not great, but let's go with that. It's just, you have to use something to describe this process. This is what we call this bottom up or feed forward, bottom up the hierarchy or feeding forward. And this is more of a top-down effect. You're saying, well, I'm using all the other information to process this thing.
So it's like an expectation.
Expectation, context, a lot of those things. Yeah. Yeah. No, but you want to no. So expectation, context, what you've learned before, all those sorts of things, and
From top down.
yeah, top down. It's again, does it map? Because your expectation could also impact your bottom up perception a lot of times. So it's not such a clean mapping, but nothing is. So you could think that we built this model last year where we think that what happens is, okay, this is the feed forward process. This is the areas that I mentioned to you. And these are units in these areas where, let's say early on, certain units are active because they're on the bear. And in the higher areas, certain other units are active. And when you get to IT, the inferotemporal, where a lot of category selective stuff are, you could see that a population response is active that signals a bear. And again, this is not just a single cell. This is a population of cells, as I mentioned it many times, where the ratio between them signals a bear. And that information can be used to create a low resolution reconstruction of what you're looking at. And again, this goes back to the idea of generation and generative processing, where you take this generative processing and you impact your perception. And that could come down and impact your processing. So you have feed forward, feedback, feed forward, feedback. You have these so-called recurrent processing going on for you to recognize an object. Now, sometimes if the object is clear, that there is no ambiguity involved with it, you may not need multiple loops. You could just do it once. It just puts it through the system, and then you could recognize it. Sometimes when the object is ambiguous, you may need multiple passes. I'm showing you a demo here. Let's say if you have two objects on top of each other, you may choose to have these top-down reconstructions come down, select one of them. For example, in this case, the 8 and the 4 are overlapping. So you have top-down reconstruction, like some low-resolution reconstruction coming, signaling out 8. So changing the feed-forward process by focusing it on only the 8, and then you switch and you focus your feed-forward processing through this feedback generation to be on the 4. Does that make sense? So you're doing multiple feed-forward passes, because every feed-forward pass takes about, let's say, 150 milliseconds. So you could have a couple of feed-forward passes for one object, a couple of feed-forward passes for another object, but each of them is modulated by our expectations and top-down generation.
So for IT, that's like further back, like the final processing step, and that's where the distributed code is mapped. Like that's the most important.
For object recognition, that would be the most important. That's where, for example, the face selective areas are. That's where the object selective area, body selective areas are in the IT. So as I showed in the anatomy earlier, I'll pull that up again, where in this anatomical figure, you could see that the IT would be here. This is posterior IT, central IT, and anterior IT. So it's a big area. So this is occipital lobe, this is temporal lobe, and that the T refers to temporal. This is frontal and parietal is up here. And the IT is also divided here to 3 regions, but there are many more, very smaller regions. For example, when I showed you the face selective region here, this is at the end, this is also IT. Now, I'll give you again another mental model. What you're seeing here is the left hemisphere. So it looks like this, and I'm opening up in the back. So if this is the visual area and this is temporal, so this area leads continuous temporal areas. So that's why you see early visual areas, FFA is a face area, PPA is a place area, and then these are all objects selected. So this is temporal lobe, occipital lobe, parietal lobe, and then frontal lobe. That's how it would look like on the 2D. And a lot of these population codes exist across the whole brain. So even the other areas do have population codes. It's just that in this case, I was showing it for this example, for the example of the bird here, it would eventually it would be in the IT where you would see categorically selected populations. All right, since we have time, I'll give you the attention thing too quickly, so we'll do the whole thing. I won't show a demo. So attention, we all know what attention is. William James said that one of the founders of modern psychology, that it's really giving something your attention, right? You're attending to my voice right now. So it means that, and then for a second, I was attending to a noise outside. I'm attending to this bottle, right? As I'm looking at something, I'm giving it a lot more of my attention and I'm processing it, but it comes at a cost, right? So for example, if I have, let's see if I have a sentence somewhere for you to read. So
Now you're going to discover why multitasking.
so if you look at the word Barak here, just keep your eyes there and try to read the sentence. How far do you get? How many words can you actually read? How many? Two maybe, right? And that's what it tells you, is that our eyes have a very high resolution fovea area, and then the rest of it is blurred. Our perception fills it all in, but the rest of the world is pretty blurry to our eyes. So when we read, we have to have this attention behavior where we start somewhere and then go to the next one, next one, next one. This is a stereotypical reading behavior, right? You just have to look through every word. You're looking at healthcare.gov, looking for something. You have to look around. These are all eye movement. Here, if I ask you what time it is and you started here, you may look here for a clock, look here for a clock. This round thing looks like a clock, and then you end up at a clock eventually, right? So this is the process of visual search. If you're looking for your keys in a drawer, you just look around until you find it. If I'm looking for a garbage can in this room. So this process of our searching for a stuff or reading something, this requires our attention behavior.
But some people say that they can read by not looking at word for word, but they'll read the entire sentence. Is that possible?
I don't think that's possible.
That's not a.
I think that's a
thing.
scam, but maybe there's
Like-
something to it.
So like everybody.
No, so you could skim a paragraph. That doesn't mean you capture everything, right? I could be sometimes when I read New York Times, I read the first sentence of a paragraph and I think I get the gist of a whole.
So it's not like they can visually see the entire sentence.
No.
Or like the whole page, photographic memory, like
I don't think so.
see the photo. Like,
I think what we can say in that, I'm not sure because that is not my area, but I think we can infer more, right? Is you use more association and inference because you're trying to connect ideas, but you don't really go to each one of the words, you know?
so
Maybe
the
some
older you
people-
are, the more holes you can fill in.
Maybe, you know, or the better you are in associating.
Oh, context,
things, context, something like that.
Okay, that's interesting.
But it's just,
It's too
I'm
obvious.
not sure it's that, I'm supposing,
I
I
mean,
mean, theory.
No, but it's interesting that people do train, they can do that.
Yeah.
What is it, this picture of?
A brain,
A what?
a brain.
No. A lung, right? So this is, if you cut the lung this way and look at it from the top, it's a scan of the lung. Well, what's wrong with it?
The lung.
No. Yeah, everyone sees the gorilla?
I'm without glasses, so for me.
Yeah, no excuses. Yeah, okay, so how long did it take you to see the gorilla?
Like 30 seconds.
Yeah, so, but it's so obvious when you see it, it's right here. It's like a whole gorilla in the.
It's like that basketball video.
What's that? Yes, so it's similar, it's, this paper is called The Invisible Gorilla Strikes Again. What they did is that they put these gorilla pictures in the scans, and then they had radiologists go through them, not knowing there were gorillas in there. They were just trying to look for nodules, right? And then they asked these people, did you see the gorilla? And 99% are like, no, I didn't see any gorillas. And it tells you something about radiologists that, and it tells you more about attention. That when you don't expect something and you're looking for something else, you're gonna miss a lot. And that's why, you don't want to text and drive, or even though you think you have a lot of, you could do multitask and all of that, but in reality, you cannot.
And I'm going to use a good example here, where you use the cell phone during classes and you think you're learning.
Exactly. Avoid doing that. So what we have here, this attention behavior is important for all of you designers. Also, it's super important, right? You want to use the element of design to bring someone's attention to something or distract them from something else. So it's important to know what causes those things. We did some of this work a little while ago where we built models where they could look at, and we basically model the brain area called superior colliculus. It's in the it's a deep and very ancestral area, like even frogs have it, and like maybe the whole visual system of a frog is a superior colliculus, because as I said, they don't have a neocortex. So we just model that, and we show that a lot of our eye movement behavior is really basic eye movement behavior is explained by just these ancestral type of mechanism. This is what the area looks like. It's in the brain, it's on top of the brain stem. So in the brain, things that are older or deeper, as you would imagine, because evolution generally stack things on top of each other. So brainstem was there, and then these things came.
What is that? What does SC stand? Is that
Superior colliculus. It's an area that I was describing. It's a small area in the brain that controls eye movement. So if you stimulate it, people will have an eye movement. So similar, I showed the stimulation where different parts of bodies were moving. This would cause eye movement. We showed that this model matches people's behavior. The cyan ones are people's eye movement. The red ones are from the model. We also wanted to apply this to reading because our collaborator, Francois, V2, had an idea that he thought that reading behavior is also very oculomotor driven, right? People would like to think the way you move your eye when you read has a lot to do with comprehension. And his idea was like, not really, maybe it's just a visual input, just there's like text and then you visual based on what that visual input is. So we applied the same thing to this corpus of French reading, and we showed that okay. We showed that we could apply the same model, start from where people start, and this would create this stereotypical reading behavior that matches people's behavior pretty well. Meaning that people think, oh, where I'm looking has a lot to do with if I'm comprehending or not. There's some degree of that, but a lot of reading probably has to do with just the fact that you have a visual input in front of you and you create this stereotypical behavior.
So you're saying most people read at the same pace? There's not that much variable.
Yeah,
You think
I
most
would
people-
say.
yeah.
And again, you could choose not to read everything, but if you're skimming something or looking for some information, but I don't think there's that much variability in people actually reading.
Which is interesting because you're right, that most people associate faster readers as being able to comprehend faster, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure how much of that is true. I think you could create somebody's making money out of it, so I'm skeptical how true it is.
be curious to see like how those differ from someone with dyslexia? Like,
Yeah.
how that
Yeah.
affects it.
They'll
Yeah.
have to, don't they read smaller?
I'm not familiar with but that's a good point in terms of what kind of difference is. And I've seen the studies where using these type of models, they try to create kind of fonts that helps dyslexics that in comprehension. These are all neurotypical people, so I don't know if that effect matters. But you could think of, oh, is there a font that would make it easier for them to read? And I think, yeah, that's an interesting thing. So we developed some other models, for example, in this case, I'm not going to go through details of it, where we were trying to see how do we build an eye in a robot or in a network, right? This is not an easy problem. Like the eye is so complex and there is like high resolution and low resolutions, but somehow the low resolution information help you do things. It's just so complex. So what people choose to do is like, what if we let the model have big eyes and then they could choose to be a smaller eyes, but if it's a big one, it would be low resolution. If it's a small one, it would be high resolution. So we tried a lot. There is no satisfying robotic eye yet. We did some work in that area, but that robotic eye is not there yet. The one that actually mimics human eye. That's all it was.
For primary slots and output slots, is that related to like the distributed code idea?
Yeah.
Okay.
So for each of them, we have a distributed code of that representation. Now, this slot suggests that maybe like working memory, like imagine someone tells you a phone number and you try to write it down. Where do you maintain those 6 numbers, right? So you can imagine there are slots associated with each of those. That is slot, and this comes from working memory research, where these slots are basically saying that, well, maybe I have a slot that associates with the first number I had, another with the second one, with the third one. So you could maintain multiple numbers in a row, something like that. But each of them is a population code. So instead of having one population code, you have the IT having multiple population code, so it can include multiple complex entities at once, like a phone line. So there's other ideas around object-based attention, and how does it that we could have an attention that groups this out of its environment? We did some research on, again, I'm not going to go into details of these, but we did some research on this and finding ways where attention could spread. This is a theory that is out there, where you're saying, when I look at this object, my attention spreads through that object, and it allows me to segment that object from its environment. And to be able, in order to grab this object, I have to know where the boundaries of it are. So I could use attention to look at parts of it, and then that helps me segment it from the environment. One last section, and then I'm done. I just wanted to tell you this because I've talked a lot about vision, but alternatively, a lot of this research has been done in language, where, for example, ChatGPT is trained how? ChatGPT is trained by completing sentences. So you give it Barack and Michelle Obama want to Harvard to visit their daughter. One of the daughters when they're apparently Malia or whatever. So if ChatGPT is trained, you give it this much, and then it's supposed to tell you what the next word is, it needs to know something about the word, right? And if you do this across the entire text on the internet, then the model learns something about the statistics of the word, right? Because there is a sentence that says the capital of New York is Albany somewhere on the internet, and ChatGPT has seen that. There's another sentence that says gravity exists on moon, and there's another one that says, you know what I mean? So if it's seen so many of these sentences, and the only thing it's trained on is to complete the sentence. Now, you could look at the representation inside the ChatGPT or other large language models and compare that representation, build encoding models of people's brain activity when they read those sentences. You could give the same sentence to a large language model that a person read in a scanner. And when they read in the scanner, they had their brain activity. So these are historically language area. This is still the temporal lobe and some parts in the frontal lobe. Some of them call this Broca area and whatnot. But it's more distributed than that. The representation of a language model can give you a really good model of predicting brain activity in response to the same sentence. What you could do with that is that now you could, for one subject, you may be able to construct sentences. So earlier I said, using diffusion models, you could construct images that maximally activate an area. Now with language models, you could construct sentences that could maximally activate an area. And the way you do that is because you have an encoding model, because you created a digital twin that could tell you the activity of different brain areas in response to different sentences. So now I could just play around with sentences using a language model and find those that maximally activate a certain brain area. And this is a nice research, paralleling the research that is done in images, applying it to the language then.
Maybe
So
it's nice to tell that your background is in engineering as well.
yes, my
Yeah,
background.
so you have more or less that in common.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why the same is so fundamental, because not only he works in neuroscience, but he understands a lot of what we do here.
Yes. So in industrial design, yeah.
Yeah, engineering,
yeah.
design, tools.
Yeah. So I think so. I would say one last thing, finishing up, is that imagine these encoding models, this what we call digital twins. These are a big part of NeuroAI research because they give you an opportunity to play around with the system in a way that you couldn't do before, right? Before you had to maybe test them on monkeys and then try to translate that into humans. But now if I have enough good enough model of a human, maybe so there's a research area now where people are like, well, if you give me a really good encoding model of the whole brain, right? Let's say this is from, let's go back. This is not pleasant for anyone, the way I'm flashing. But let's say I have a good model that could predict neural activity in the brain. Can I figure out areas that maybe are associated with depressive behavior and try to generate images that would change the mood of the person? Can I generate images that would move representation and activation in directions that stimulate dopamine areas, right? So it opens up a whole area of non-invasive therapies where you could just generate images, generate sentences, generate audios, or multimodal stuff, and it all depends on those engineered models being really good at generating this stuff, where you could actually help create therapeutic content for one individual. This is a big area. Or people who are suffering from macular degeneracy and some pathways are not working well. Can we generate images that could get through that? That way you could modify images in a way, an example of modify fonts in a way that makes text easier for certain people. Can you modify it in a way that makes images easier to perceive for certain other people? So this, I want you to go away with this idea of this digital twins are being very useful for encoding, but also for decoding, for learning how to decode information from the brain. If we could experiment with this digital twin rather than the original model.
Is it, have implications for like generated realities? Like, could it get to a point where, you think you're happy, but then you're stimulated, but you're not really happy, like.
What's
like,
the difference?
Yeah, exactly. Are you, like, if you look at the sun and
Yeah.
you're happy looking at the sun, but then somebody stimulate your brain to feel the same way as looking at the sun, is that real? Is that not real?
But I don't know, but as you said, for instance, my parents are doctors, right? And there was a guy with a severe depression that couldn't be, he tried everything, didn't work out. And then he did this thing that you said, was the only thing that helped him,
TMS.
TMS. Pure his depression only. He tried all the medicines, didn't work. It's what is real, the guy was almost suicidal. And he was so good because I don't think maybe biologically, I don't know if there is a difference because you're affecting really
Yeah, that's a physiological
yeah,
response.
completely.
Yeah. And then I guess there's also emotional depression, we talking about it in treat, kind of. If it's
Yeah,
a
I think
physical.
I think these models will help us be more targeting certain areas better. Meaning that, so TMS is done now, this is RTMS or transcranial magnetic stimulation is done to certain areas. I feel like if we know more about the connectivity of brain areas and how they respond to different images, maybe you could pair images with stimulation. Maybe we could do other stuff, right? I feel like it's just opening up this
It's
space.
encoding as well as decoding.
Yeah, like you know what the brain activity would be in response to something. Can you use that to stimulate certain area with images, stimulate certain area with TMS, and then strengthen certain pathways that are more healthy than other pathways that lead you in the path of like depressive state and stuff
I
like
just
that.
remember when I studied, I don't know where I read it, but where I studied with like lavender oil aromatherapy, and then when I went to the example, I also then triggered the lavender oil so that it would trigger them. Like I was trying to encode my brain to remember what I was studying, but
Yeah.
like you can do these triggers anyway, right?
Yeah, there are a lot of natural triggers, and you could create them yourself in order to mnemonics to help you remember things better. But I feel like there's a lot of those opportunities now that like recording from the brain and creating these networks. You want to eventually get to a place where you can actually, do, and there are a lot of brain modulation techniques like electrical modulations or TMS. There are some new methods based on ultrasound for stimulating the brain, and those are really interesting. So there are new methods coming where you can stimulate the brain based on these what you're recording from and based on understanding you have from those brains. So I think, again, it's an exciting area. Think about how these non-invasive methods can help individuals deal with all these things.
And also like what she pointed out about emotions or changing the emotions. Emotions, I don't know how they really work in that sense, but it's really
How do you change emotions?
because I don't know if, okay, they are cultural as well, so it's like, but if you think that your organism is inserted in an environment that you're computing, you're changing that as well.
Yeah, I think you could change those things. Yeah, stimulations should be able to change that. Medication, like it's gonna be a holistic.
Does it reduce everything that we feel to a chemical reaction then?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. There is the experience related to a lot of things, for sure.
But the experience, how we understand it, is a representation.
Yeah.
I think so. Now I'm gonna question everything.
Yeah.
I think we're well over time. All
But
right,
it's
I'm
the
gonna.
meaning, right? A lot of people do exercise to feel better. And
Wraps up the recording.
Whether or not they really do
Yeah.
feel better,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, so we just ended the class with let's question reality.